was Foundations and Intergroup Contact Research, Allport's The Nature of Prejudice. So this was written in 1954, obviously at the height of a lot of conversation about, racial inequality and discrimination in the US. So the book is compiled of 31 chapters, and it discusses in details what kinds of things influence prejudice, how prejudice often leads to discrimination, and how people come to think and act the ways they do regarding outgroup members, and how groups interact with one another. A major component of the book was regarding group interactions and how prejudice impacts them, and how those interactions can also affect prejudice. So if we go to the next slide. So the key takeaways, Allport determined it can be quite difficult to reduce prejudice, and he overall held a negative viewpoint on the likelihood that we would see any improvement in this area in the US. Obviously, some research since then has found that we have actually improved in a lot of ways since the 50s. Obviously, there's still work to be done. But on that regard, there's a lot that's been taken as truth from his book. There's also some things like that that have been questioned. He felt that prejudice was a main cause for discrimination, and any actions taken on behalf of prejudice, even as simply as speaking negatively about the outgroup in question, was more likely to lead towards violence and other discriminatory acts, whether that's systematic oppression and things like that. So he felt it was a slippery slope, so to speak, if you act on any prejudice that you have. He determined 4 key conditions for positive intergroup contact, which were equal status, common goals, intergroup cooperation, and support of authorities, law, or customs. Those are plain as what they sound like, that hopefully if you want to encourage positive intergroup contact, you'll have people who have somewhat equal standing with one another. They'll have similar goals they can work towards. They will work well together, and that they both recognize an authority that can help oversee those interactions. He also reported that genuine interaction is more helpful in reducing prejudice and building positive relationships than brief interactions. So actually getting to know somebody and moving past stereotypes. And as I mentioned a little bit ago, not all of the points in the book have been reaffirmed through further research, but a lot of it has, and it's definitely given us a foundation that we can refer to as we move forward and learn more about prejudice and discrimination, as well as intergroup contact theory, and how all of those different pieces play together, and how we can hopefully move toward more peaceful interactions between groups and reducing things like stereotype and prejudice.
So it's great to review this really seminal work that has led to these large research fields like intergroup contact theory, and it's interesting to see how some of the concepts and the sort of the theoretical bases that that Allport created, some of them have sort of been validated, some not, but in general the concepts ring true, and I know that there's been research to determine if those 4 key conditions are actually necessary for positive intergroup contact, and the meta-analyses that I've read suggest that while they're not necessary for positive outcomes from intergroup contact, they can enhance, be a moderator and enhance the positive relationship. So they might help, but they're not necessarily necessary.
And Jeremy, was that Pettigrew's meta-analysis that you looked at?
That's one of them, yeah.
Yeah, I looked at that one a little bit. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely given a jumping off point for a lot of people since then. It's been cited and referred to a lot.
Yeah.
The 50s, but right, I think it's given us a lot of things to question though and evaluate further, and what group positive contact really looks like.
Yeah, this Allport's work and Sharif's work, which we're going to look at next, and then some other sort of foundational work in social psychology, emerged at this really interesting time, right? So number one, in the U.S., there were obviously real, you can put your finger on them, systemic rules that were creating all kinds of racial and prejudicial, just I guess you could just say it's just pure systemic racism. But then also was coming out of World War II and sort of recognizing, the Holocaust and this phenomenon of, sort of millions of people in Germany joining the Nazi Party and coming on board with this sort of mass extermination of groups of people. And so that was like that. It was like a red flag in the psychology world, and all this social psychology research just started coming out, and people thinking about this a lot, like what creates racism, prejudice, what creates intergroup violence, like what is happening on the psychological level.
Yeah, and I was reading too that one of the things he suggested was that people go with the flow. So not necessarily because they agree with the stereotype or the prejudice, but it's just easier to follow it. And so the example I think was given about soldiers in World War II, where if they were segregated, some people they didn't care whether they were segregated or not, but it was just easier to go along with it than to fight that.
Yeah. Well, there you go. You have the whole basis for groupthink, right? It's hard to be a dissenter, and there's interesting research about dissent and like what it takes, and like if you're in a group of people and everybody agrees in this thing, even though even though it's like obviously an illusion, obviously incorrect, people are willing to go along with it, but they're less likely to go along with it if only one person in the group, one other person actually dissents first or disagrees. Then you're more likely to speak up. So the collective dissent away from sort of just illusory thinking in general, but also like prejudicial attitudes, I think is important.
Definitely. I think it's interesting to look at this study too. And I mean, because it is so foundational, but to see these kind of the 4 conditions that he came up with, like the equal status, common goals, intergroup cooperation, and the support of authorities, also as kind of I could see how a lot of intergroup contact among the like studies among the workplace, how these 4 have shown up in a lot of our other studies that we've looked at. Kind of the idea of if you have like a diverse organization, having that inclusivity, that equal status, and everything that you do, having the common goals to help you work together for intergroup cooperation, and then having that culture, that systems, policies in place, or the support. It all kind of fits together.
What you all have already said and this research, it reminds me of 2 things. One was Jane Elliott's experiment that she did, the blue-eyed versus the brown-eyed.
Yeah.
Where she literally separated the class, the blue-eyed group and the brown-eyed group, and she only told them that one was better than the other. Yeah. And she said it. And they began to behave that way because she said it. Even the ones that felt that it wasn't right, because she said it, they began to operate and to act that way. And then to treat the classmates that the day before, they had all treated the same, but because, now they were in that special group, and because they had been told they were in that special group, they began to see themselves as better. And then, she did it with children, but it's also been done with adults. And the same phenomenon happens, that even though people know better, they will behave in that way. And then the other thing it made me think about, like particularly with the common goals and the intergroup cooperation, it's like sports teams tend to pride themselves on operating that way. Well, we have a common goal, common mission.
Yeah.
We're all focused on winning and overcoming. But then if you break it down and if you really go and ask each member, while they may have those common goals and feel united, and in that aspect, a lot of times they still don't necessarily feel as if they have equal status. And they still may feel that there are other ways that there is discrimination present or even prejudices. So I think, and of course, you can have the common goals and you can even have a well-functioning team or organization and still have prejudices and discrimination, inequality. And the military, I think, is the same way. I think they're showing that daily, that you can have both. Both can be true.
You know, do you know Milgram's classic experiments on authority, on obedience? And he showed different, just really interesting studies, just classic studies on like people obeying authority, and just and it reminds me of that the study where what was her name that you mentioned, with the blue eyes and the brown eyes or something?
Jane Elliott.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that study where just a figure of authority just tells you something and you believe it and you start acting that way, you know. And because he was doing experiments after the World War II too, to figure out why were people following authority without sort of much thought. So it's very interesting to see like how these two things merge, where you're so like you can create a minimal group paradigm, which is just like you can create a group out of anything. You could tell you guys are red shirts and you guys are blue shirts, and it's just you all of a sudden have this group mentality. And then one authority figure can say, you know, I believe in this group, but I don't believe in this group. I mean, and that's been shown in all kinds of different research, just, you know, leader belief or something, and how that affects, you know, the confidence and performance and stuff. So yeah, group minds are very weird things.